The autumn afternoon painted Cincinnati in shades of amber and gold, the kind of light that made even the mundane seem somehow significant. Pete Rose stood in line at the Kroger on Madison Road, a basket hanging from his weathered hand, containing nothing more than a few essentials: bread, milk, coffee, and a pack of cigarettes he'd been meaning to quit for the better part of a decade. At 73 years old, he'd learned that some habits were harder to break than records. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their sterile glow across the linoleum floors that had seen better days. Pete shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his knees reminding him of all those headfirst slides into second base. All those games played with reckless abandon. He didn't mind waiting. These days he had nothing but time. The line moved slowly, as lines in supermarkets often do on Tuesday afternoons, when the elderly came out to shop and teenage cashiers moved with the urgency of molasses. Pete found himself studying the magazines on the nearby rack, his own face staring back at him from a sports retrospective. "Baseball's most controversial legend," the headline read. He looked away. That's when he noticed her. She was young, couldn't have been more than 25, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worries too heavy for someone her age. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore scrubs decorated with cartoon characters. A pediatric nurse, Pete guessed, or maybe she worked at a daycare. In her cart, a toddler sat quietly, a little girl with pigtails who clutched a worn, stuffed rabbit and looked around with wide, curious eyes. The young mother was unloading her groceries onto the conveyor belt with practiced efficiency. Store-brand cereal, macaroni and cheese boxes, canned vegetables, a small package of chicken that had a discount sticker on it, diapers, and a single box of crayons. Pete noticed she put each item down carefully, as if calculating the cost in her head with each placement. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, began scanning items with mechanical precision. Beep, beep, beep. The digital display climbed steadily, $23.47, $31.82, $45.16. Pete watched as the young mother's hand unconsciously moved to her back pocket, then to her purse, checking and rechecking. Her jaw tightened slightly, a micro-expression of anxiety that Pete recognized from his gambling days, from all those times he'd bet more than he should have, and waited for the outcome with his heart in his throat. "Your total is £67.34, the cashier announced, her voice flat and tired. The young mother's face went pale. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened her wallet and began counting bills. 120, another 20, 3 fives, a collection of ones. Pete watched her count once, then twice, her lips moving silently. The little girl in the cart started to fuss, sensing her mother's distress with that uncanny intuition children possess. "Mama," the child said softly. "It's okay, baby," the young mother whispered, but her voice cracked at the edges. She looked up at the cashier, and Pete could see the shame coloring her cheeks red. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I miscalculated. I only have $53. Can you take off the chicken and the crayons?" The cashier sighed, a sound weighted with the exhaustion of dealing with humanity's struggles day after day, and reached for the items to void them. But the young mother's hand shot out, stopping her. "Wait," she said, her voice stronger now despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Keep the chicken. Just take off the crayons. She doesn't really need them." Oh, but the little girl had been watching, and at the mention of the crayons, her face crumpled. She didn't throw a tantrum or scream. She just looked down at her stuffed rabbit, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. That silent disappointment was somehow worse than any outburst could have been. Something twisted in Pete's chest. He'd seen that look before, decades ago, in his own children's eyes during the lean years, during the scandals, during all the times his choices had consequences for people who didn't deserve to pay for them. He thought about all the money he'd won and lost over the years, the millions that had passed through his hands like water, the bets placed on impulse and pride. Pete Rose had never been known for his sentiment. Charlie Hustle, they'd called him. The hit king. A man who played baseball like every game was Game 7 of the World Series, who slid headfirst into bases and bowled over catchers and accumulated 4,256 hits through sheer force of will and relentless determination. He'd been called a lot of things in his life: legendary, reckless, disgraceful, unforgivable, but rarely had he been called kind. Yet standing there in that supermarket line, watching a young mother fight to hold back tears, while her daughter learned what it meant to go without, something old and buried stirred in Pete's heart. Maybe it was the autumn light filtering through the windows, golden and forgiving. Maybe it was the weight of his 73 years pressing down on him, making him wonder what legacy he'd actually leave behind when all the statistics were tallied and all the controversies laid to rest. Or maybe it was simply that he'd spent so many years being selfish that even a small act of selflessness felt revolutionary. He stepped forward, his hand already reaching for his wallet. "Excuse me," Pete said, his rough voice cutting through the tension. "I've got this." The young mother turned to look at him, confusion and surprise mingling on her face. The cashier paused, her hand hovering over the keyboard. Even the little girl stopped sniffling and stared at the stranger who'd spoken. "I'm sorry," the young mother said. Pete pulled out his wallet, worn leather that had been with him for years, and extracted 2 crisp $50 bills. He handed them to the cashier without ceremony. "Ring up everything, including what she was going to take off, and add those crayons back. Actually make it the big box, the 64 count. "Sir, you don't have to," the young mother started, but Pete raised his hand gently. "I know I don't have to," he said, "but I want to. Consider it. An investment in her future." He nodded toward the little girl, who was now looking at him with wonder, as if he'd just performed an actual miracle. The cashier, perhaps sensing something significant was happening, quietly retrieved the items and scanned them. The young mother stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Pete avoided her gaze, suddenly feeling awkward under the weight of her gratitude. "I don't know what to say," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means." Pete shrugged, uncomfortable with praise he wasn't sure he deserved. Everyone needs a little help sometimes. No shame in that. The cashier handed Pete his change, which he waved off. "Keep it," he said, "or give it to her." He gestured toward the young mother. As Pete picked up his basket and prepared to leave, the little girl's voice stopped him. "Thank you, mister," she said, her small voice clear and sincere. "You're nice." Pete turned back, and for the first time in what felt like years, he smiled genuinely. "You take care of your mama, okay? She's working real hard for you." The little girl nodded solemnly, as if accepting a sacred duty. Pete made his way toward the exit, aware of the eyes following him, of the whispers beginning to circulate among the other customers who'd witnessed the exchange. He pushed through the automatic doors into the cooling autumn air, taking a deep breath that filled his lungs with the scent of fallen leaves and approaching evening. His truck sat in the parking lot, a beat-up Ford that had seen better days, much like its owner. As Pete climbed in and started the engine, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. The same lined face looked back at him, the same gray hair, the same eyes that had seen too much. But something felt different, lighter somehow. He pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward home, a small apartment on the east side of town that he'd lived in since his 3rd divorce. The radio played an oldies station, and Pete found himself humming along to a song from his youth, from those days when the world had seemed full of nothing but possibility, and every swing of the bat might be the one that changed everything. Pete didn't know it yet, but that simple act in the supermarket would set off a chain of events that would ripple outward in ways he couldn't imagine. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. Sometimes a moment of kindness can be the stone that starts an avalanche. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Pete Rose drove through the streets of Cincinnati, the city that had made him and broken him in equal measure. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt something that had been absent from his life for years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right. The video appeared online 3 days later. Pete Rose was sitting in his apartment, a beer in one hand and the TV remote in the other, flipping through channels without really watching any of them. The Reds were playing the Cardinals, but he couldn't bring himself to focus on the game. Baseball used to be everything to him, the only thing that mattered. Now it was just another reminder of what he'd lost, of the Hall of Fame that would never have his plaque, of the legacy that would always be tainted by a single word: gambling. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. Then it buzzed again, and again. Frowning, Pete set down his beer and picked up the device. Text messages were flooding in, from his daughter, from old teammates, from people he hadn't heard from in years. All of them contained links to the same video. "Dad, is this you?" His daughter's message read. "It's going viral." With a sense of foreboding, Pete clicked the link. The video was grainy, clearly shot on someone's cell phone from a few checkout lanes over. But the scene was unmistakable. Pete Rose, standing in line at Kroger, stepping forward to pay for a young mother's groceries. The audio was muffled, but you could hear the exchange, could see the moment Pete handed over the money, could witness the young mother's tears and her daughter's grateful smile. The video had been posted by someone named a Cincinnati Mom 22 with the caption, "Faith in humanity restored. A stranger paid for this young mom's groceries today, didn't even give his name. This is what kindness looks like. Be like this man." Pete stared at his phone, watching the view count climb in real time. 47,000 views, 52,000, 68,000. The comments section was exploding. Who is this guy? We need more people like him in the world. The way he didn't make a big deal about it, just did it and walked away, that's real character. And did you see him turn down the change? Legend. Then about 30 comments down, someone had written, "Wait, is that Pete Rose?" Pete's stomach dropped. Within an hour, sports blogs had picked up the story. By that evening, it was on the local news. By the next morning, ESPN was running segments about it, debating whether this changed anything about Pete's legacy, whether a single act of kindness could balance the scales against a lifetime of controversy. Pete's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews, morning shows wanted him to appear, a literary agent called about a book deal. Even his ex-wives reached out, which was perhaps the most surprising development of all. He ignored most of it, but not all of it. His daughter, Fawn, came over that evening, letting herself in with the spare key he'd given her. "Dad," she said, finding him on the couch where he'd barely moved all day. "Have you seen what's happening online?" "Yeah," Pete grunted. "I've seen it." Fawn sat down beside him, and Pete was struck by how much she'd grown up, this woman who'd once been his little girl. She had his determination in her eyes, but her mother's kindness in her smile. "People are calling you a hero," she said softly. Pete laughed, but there was no humor in it. "For spending $100, that's a low bar for heroism. It's not about the money, Dad. It's about the gesture, about seeing someone in need and actually doing something about it." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "People want to believe you're more than your mistakes. This gives them permission to do that." Pete looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the hope in her eyes. She wanted to be proud of him. She'd spent her whole life defending him, explaining him, loving him, despite everything. And here, finally, was something she could point to and say, "See, this is who my father really is." The weight of that realization settled over Pete like a heavy blanket. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said quietly. "I didn't do it to rehabilitate my image or because I thought someone was watching. That little girl looked so sad. And I remembered. Remembered what? Remembered what it was like. When you kids were young during the bad times, your mother stretching every dollar, trying to keep things normal for you. I wasn't around enough. I was too focused on the game, on the bets, on all the wrong things. I can't go back and fix that, but I could help that woman, so I did." Fawn reached over and squeezed her father's hand. "Maybe that's exactly why it matters, Dad." Meanwhile, across town in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Norwood, Sarah Mitchell was experiencing her own form of shock. Sarah was the young mother from the supermarket, and she'd been working double shifts at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, trying to make ends meet as a single parent. Her daughter, Emma, was everything to her. The reason she got up before dawn, the reason she pushed through exhaustion, the reason she kept going when everything felt impossible. That day at Kroger, Sarah had been at her breaking point. Her ex-husband was 3 months behind on child support. Her car needed a new transmission she couldn't afford. Her student loans from nursing school were crushing her, and she'd just realized, standing at that checkout counter, that she'd miscalculated her budget by $15. $15. Such a small amount, yet it might as well have been $1,500. Then that man had appeared, like something out of a story, and just helped. No judgment, no lecture, no strings attached, just pure, simple kindness. Sarah hadn't recognized him at the time. She'd been too overwhelmed, too grateful, too busy trying not to completely break down in the middle of the grocery store. But now, seeing the video everywhere, seeing his face in the news articles, she knew exactly who he was. Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle, the hit king, banned from baseball for life. One of the most controversial figures in sports history. And the man who'd saved her from complete humiliation and allowed her daughter to have crayons. Sarah's phone was blowing up too. Friends and co-workers had seen the video, recognized her and Emma. They wanted to know the whole story. Local news stations wanted interviews. Someone had even started a GoFundMe page for her without her permission, which made her deeply uncomfortable, but also, if she was honest with herself, profoundly grateful. "Mama, why is everyone talking about the nice man?" Emma asked, looking up from her coloring book, filled with drawings made with those 64 crayons that had meant so much. Sarah sat down beside her daughter, pulling her close. Because sometimes, sweetheart, when someone does something kind, it reminds other people to be kind too. It's like when you drop a stone in water and the ripples spread out. Is the nice man coming back? I don't know, baby. But Sarah thought maybe she wanted him to. Not because of who he was or what he represented, but because she'd never properly thanked him. In that moment at the store, she'd been too shocked, too emotional. Now, with some distance, she wanted him to know what his gesture had really meant. It wasn't just about the groceries, though those mattered. It wasn't just about the money, though that helped. It was about being seen, being valued, being reminded that she mattered, that her struggle was visible, that someone cared. Sarah made a decision. She picked up her phone and started typing an email to the local news station that had been most persistent in requesting an interview. "I'll do it," she wrote, "but only if Pete Rose agrees to be there too. I want to thank him properly." 3 days later, Pete found himself sitting in a small studio at WCPO Channel 9, feeling more nervous than he'd ever felt stepping up to the plate in the bottom of the 9th with the game on the line. Sarah sat across from him, Emma on her lap, and the anchor, a professional woman in her 40s named Jennifer Wright, sat between them with questions prepared on her tablet. "Pete, Sarah, thank you both for being here," Jennifer began. "Pete, let's start with you. What made you decide to help Sarah that day?" Pete shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under the studio lights. "I didn't decide anything. I just saw someone who needed help, and I was in a position to give it, that's all. But you must have known how it would look given your complicated history with public perception." Pete's jaw tightened. "I didn't know anyone was filming. I didn't do it for publicity. If I'd known it would turn into all this, I might have..." "Might have what?" Jennifer pressed. Pete looked at Sarah, at little Emma, who was staring at him with those wide, trusting eyes. "I still would have done it," he said finally, "because it was the right thing to do." Sarah leaned forward. "Can I say something?" Jennifer nodded. "I don't care about Pete's past," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "I don't care about baseball controversies or Hall of Fame debates. What I care about is that when I was at my lowest point, feeling like I was failing my daughter, this man saw my humanity. He didn't see a statistic or a sob story. He saw another person struggling, and he helped. That's who Pete Rose is to me and Emma. That's the only version of him that matters in our story." Pete felt something catch in his throat. He wasn't a man prone to crying, hadn't cried when he was banned from baseball, hadn't cried at his father's funeral, hadn't cried through 3 divorces, but sitting there, hearing this young woman defend him with such conviction, he felt dangerously close. "Thank you," he managed to say. Emma, who'd been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Pete, I drawed you a picture." She held up a piece of paper covered in crayon drawings, stick figures holding hands, a sun, a house, hearts everywhere. In the corner, in uneven child's handwriting, were the words, "Thank you." Pete took the drawing with hands that shook slightly. This is the best thing anyone's ever given me, Emma. Thank you." The interview continued, but Pete barely registered it. He kept looking at that drawing, at the simple joy and gratitude contained in its crayon lines, and he thought about legacy, about what really matters at the end of the day. About the fact that he'd probably never make it into the Hall of Fame, never be forgiven by baseball purists, never escape the shadow of his mistakes. But maybe, just maybe, he could be remembered by one little girl as the man who was kind when kindness mattered most. And perhaps that was enough. As they wrapped up and the cameras stopped rolling, Sarah approached Pete. "Can I give you a hug?" she asked. Pete nodded, and she embraced him with genuine warmth. "You changed my life," she whispered. "Not just with the money. You gave me hope. Thank you." Pete hugged her back, awkward but sincere. "You take care of that little girl. She's something special." "I will. I promise." Outside the studio, the autumn air had turned crisp, winter announcing its eventual arrival. Pete walked to his truck, Emma's drawing carefully folded in his shirt pocket, and he realized something had shifted fundamentally inside him. For years, he'd been carrying the weight of his mistakes like a stone around his neck, drowning in regret and bitterness. But that simple act in the supermarket had cracked something open, had shown him that redemption wasn't about grand gestures or public apologies, or even being forgiven by institutions and authorities. It was about moments, about choices, about being the person you wished you'd been all along, even if you couldn't change the past. The video had been viewed over 3 million times now. It had inspired copycat acts of kindness across the country. Be Like Pete was trending on Twitter. People were sharing their own stories of helping strangers, of paying it forward, of choosing kindness. One act, one moment, one choice. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. 2 weeks after the interview aired, Pete Rose received a letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, addressed in careful handwriting, with a return address from Cooperstown, New York. Pete stared at it for a long moment, sitting at his kitchen table with cold coffee forgotten beside him, before finally opening it with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten note on official Baseball Hall of Fame stationery. "Dear Mr. Rose, my name is Marcus Thompson, and I've been a curator at the Baseball Hall of Fame for 23 years. I'm writing to you personally, not in any official capacity, because I wanted you to know something. I've given tours to thousands of visitors over the years. I've watched families walk through these halls, seen fathers point out their heroes to their sons, witness the tears of elderly men remembering their youth. And do you know the one question I'm asked more than any other? Where's Pete Rose? Every day, someone asks. Every single day. And every day, I have to explain why you're not here. And I watch disappointment cloud their faces, because regardless of what you did, regardless of the rules you broke, you are a part of baseball history. Your absence is a hole in the story we're trying to tell. I saw the video from the supermarket, I watched your interview, and I thought about legacy, what it means, how it's built, whether it can be rebuilt. I don't have answers, Mr. Rose. But I wanted you to know that there are people here, people who love this game, who wish things were different. Maybe that matters, maybe it doesn't. But I thought you should know. Respectfully, Marcus Thompson. Pete read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with the drawing Emma had made for him, the thank you cards that had been pouring in from strangers, and the newspaper clippings his daughter kept sending him. That afternoon, Pete did something he hadn't done in years. He went to Great American Ballpark. He'd avoided it mostly, unable to bear being so close to the game he loved and had lost. But today, with autumn sunshine warming his shoulders and the Reds playing an afternoon game against the Pirates, Pete found himself drawn back to the place where he'd become a legend. He bought a ticket with cash, upper deck, nosebleed section, where nobody would recognize an old man in a Reds cap and sunglasses. The crowd was modest for a Wednesday afternoon, mostly retirees and school groups. The die-hard fans who still showed up even though the team hadn't been competitive in years. Pete settled into his seat and for the first time in a long time just watched baseball. The crack of the bat, the smell of hot dogs and beer, the 7th inning stretch. The way the infield dirt looked in the afternoon light. All of it washed over him in waves of nostalgia, so powerful he had to grip the armrests to steady himself. "Excuse me, are you Pete Rose?" Pete looked over to find an elderly man, probably in his 80s, peering at him with watery blue eyes. "Just watching the game," Pete said non-committally. The old man smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had been. "My daddy brought me to Crosley Field in '63 to see you play in your rookie season. I was 14 years old. You hit a triple that day, and I swear I'd never seen anyone run the bases that fast, like your pants were on fire." Despite himself, Pete smiled. "I remember that triple, off Bob Perky. Thought I could stretch it to a home run, but the center fielder had a cannon for an arm." The old man laughed. "You always ran like that, like every hit might be your last, so you'd better make it count." He paused, his expression turning serious. "I saw what you did for that young mother. My wife passed away 3 years ago, and since then I've been wondering what mark I'll leave on this world. You reminded me that it's the small things, the human things. Thank you for that." "I didn't do much," Pete said quietly. "You did enough." After the man returned to his seat, Pete sat in the stadium feeling the ghosts of his past all around him. Every seat held a memory. Every angle of the field reminded him of a play, a game, a moment of glory or failure. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Rose, this is Marcus Thompson, the curator who wrote to you. I'm in Cincinnati for a conference. Would you be willing to meet for coffee?" Pete stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Grater's Ice Cream on Madison, I'll buy." The next morning, Pete arrived at Grater's 15 minutes early and ordered black coffee and a scoop of black raspberry chip, a Cincinnati tradition. He sat by the window, watching people pass by on the sidewalk, each absorbed in their own lives, their own struggles and triumphs. Marcus Thompson arrived precisely on time. He was younger than Pete expected, maybe late 40s, African-American, with close-cropped hair and intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses. He carried a leather messenger bag that looked well-worn and loved. "Mr. Rose," Marcus said, extending his hand, "thank you for meeting me." "Just Pete," Pete said, shaking his hand. "You want something? Coffee? Ice cream? Both, if I'm honest. I've heard legendary things about this place." After they'd settled in with their orders, Marcus pulled out a tablet from his bag. "I brought something to show you. I hope you don't mind." He turned the screen toward Pete. It was a mock-up, a digital rendering of what a Pete Rose exhibit might look like in the Hall of Fame. Statistics displayed on the walls, photos from different eras of his career. A video screen showing highlights, even a replica of one of his jerseys. "This isn't official," Marcus said quickly. "It's just something I work on sometimes, in my spare time, a reminder of what's missing." Pete studied the images, feeling a complex mixture of longing and resignation. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to know that your absence isn't invisible. We feel it. Baseball fans feel it. And I've been thinking a lot lately about what the Hall of Fame is really for." Marcus leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "Is it a temple to moral perfection? Or is it a museum documenting the history of the game? All of it, the good and bad, the heroes and the flawed humans. Because if it's the latter, then excluding you is dishonest. It's pretending that a huge part of baseball history simply didn't happen." "I broke the rules," Pete said. "I bet on baseball. I lied about it for years. Those are facts." "Yes, they are. And those facts should be part of your exhibit, not hidden, not glorified, but acknowledged. Here's this man who got 4,156 hits, who played with unmatched intensity, who embodied the spirit of the game. And here's how he betrayed it. Both truths can coexist." Pete was quiet for a long moment. "What changed your mind? Why are you telling me this now?" Marcus smiled sadly. "That video changed my mind. Or maybe it didn't change my mind so much as clarify what I already believed. I saw a man who made mistakes, living with those mistakes, who still chose to be kind, who still chose to do the right thing when it mattered. That's the complete story. That's the real human being. And isn't that what we should be preserving? Not sanitized legends, but actual people in all their complexity." "The commissioner would never allow it," Pete said. "The rules are clear. Rules can change. Perspectives can evolve. Nothing is permanent." Marcus closed his tablet. "I'm not saying I can make this happen. I can't. But I wanted you to know that there are people working within the institution who believe your story deserves to be told, completely and honestly." They talked for another hour, ranging across topics from baseball to redemption to what makes a life meaningful. Marcus told Pete about his own struggles, growing up in inner-city Detroit, losing his brother to gang violence, using baseball as an escape, and eventually finding his way to Cooperstown. Pete found himself sharing things he rarely discussed: his regrets about his failed marriages, his wish that he'd been a better father, his ongoing struggle with the temptation to gamble. "You know what the hardest part is?" Pete said finally. "It's not the ban. It's not being excluded from the Hall of Fame. It's the question that keeps me up at night. If I could go back and choose differently, would I? Would I give up those bets to have my legacy intact? And the honest answer is, I don't know. Because those bets were who I was at the time. The gambling wasn't separate from me. It was part of me. So in rejecting that, am I rejecting myself?" Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's the thing about redemption. It's not about becoming a different person. It's about becoming more fully yourself, including the parts you're not proud of, integrating them instead of running from them." "Is that what you think I'm doing? Seeking redemption?" "I think you're seeking peace, and maybe that's the same thing." As they parted ways outside Grater's, Marcus said, "Keep doing what you're doing, Pete. Keep being kind. Keep showing up as the person you are today, not the person you were 30 years ago. That matters more than you know." Pete drove home slowly, taking side streets through neighborhoods he'd known all his life. Cincinnati had changed so much, yet remained fundamentally the same. Buildings rose and fell, businesses came and went, but the spirit of the city endured, working class, unpretentious, loyal. Back at his apartment, Pete sat down with his laptop, something he used mostly for checking baseball scores and watching YouTube videos of old games. But today, he had a different purpose. He started typing, "I'm not good with words. I'm a baseball player, or at least I was. I'm better with actions than explanations. But I want to say something about what happened at that supermarket and what's happened since. I made mistakes in my life, big ones. I broke rules I should have followed. I hurt people I should have protected. I disappointed fans who believed in me. Those are facts, and I don't expect anyone to forget them or forgive them. But I'm 73 years old now, and I've spent a lot of years thinking about who I was and who I want to be. I can't change what I did, but I can choose what I do next. That day at Kroger, I saw a young mother struggling, and I helped her because I could. That's it. No ulterior motive, no publicity stunt. Just a moment when someone needed something I could provide. What I didn't expect was how that moment would change me. Sarah and her daughter Emma reminded me that life isn't about statistics or records or what gets written on your Hall of Fame plaque. It's about the moments when we choose to see each other's humanity and act accordingly. I don't know if I'll ever be forgiven for my past. I don't know if I deserve to be. But I know that every day I wake up, I have a choice. I can be bitter about what I've lost, or I can be grateful for what I still have. I can focus on closed doors, or I can look for ways to be useful, to be kind, to matter in small ways. I'm choosing the latter, not because it will rehabilitate my image or get me into the Hall of Fame, but because it's the right way to live. If my story inspires anyone to help someone else, to show kindness when it's needed, to choose humanity over indifference, then maybe all the controversy, all the pain, all the mistakes, maybe they weren't for nothing. Thank you for giving me a second chance to get this right. Pete Rose. He posted it on Facebook, the one social media platform he somewhat understood, and closed the laptop before he could second-guess himself. Within minutes, the post started getting reactions, shares, comments. But Pete didn't check them. He'd said what he needed to say, and the rest was out of his hands. Instead, he pulled out Emma's drawing and Marcus's letter and looked at them side by side. A child's gratitude rendered in crayon and a curator's hope expressed in careful handwriting. Two pieces of evidence that maybe, just maybe, legacy wasn't fixed, that it was something continuously created, moment by moment, choice by choice. Pete Rose had been many things in his life: a record breaker, a rule breaker, a legend, a disgrace. But sitting there in his quiet apartment, holding these small tokens of connection and possibility, he thought maybe he could add one more thing to that list. A work in progress, and perhaps at 73 years old, that was exactly what he needed to be. The Cincinnati winter arrived with its characteristic gray skies and biting wind that swept down from the Ohio River and settled into your bones. But despite the cold, something warm was spreading through the city, a movement that had started with one act in a supermarket and was now taking on a life of its own. It started small. A businessman in Hyde Park paid for the coffee of everyone in line behind him at Starbucks. A teacher at Withrow High School anonymously covered the lunch debt for 15 students. An elderly woman at the Western Hills Kroger handed the cashier $200 and said, "Use this for whoever needs help today." The local news started calling it the Pete Rose effect. People were inspired, they said, by seeing that even someone with such a complicated past could choose kindness, could make a difference. If Pete Rose could help a stranger without expectation of reward or recognition, then what was stopping anyone else? Sarah Mitchell watched all of this unfold with a mixture of wonder and discomfort. The GoFundMe that someone had started for her had raised over $50,000, money she desperately needed but felt guilty accepting. Strangers wanted to help her, wanted to be part of the story, wanted to transform her moment of vulnerability into something meaningful. "Mama, why do people keep sending us things?" Emma asked one December afternoon, looking at the stack of packages that had arrived. Toys, books, gift cards, even a check from an anonymous donor that would cover 3 months of rent. Sarah sat down with her daughter on the worn couch of their small apartment, trying to find words that would make sense to a 4-year-old. "Remember when Mr. Pete helped us at the store? Well, that made other people want to help too. It's like when you share your toys at daycare and then other kids want to share their toys too. Because it feels good. Yes, baby, because it feels good." But Sarah was struggling. The attention, the money, the constant requests for interviews, it was overwhelming. She was a private person, someone who'd always worked hard and kept her head down and asked for nothing from anyone. Now her life was on display, her struggles public knowledge, and she wasn't sure how to navigate this new reality. She called Pete one evening in mid-December. She had his number now. They'd exchanged contact information after the interview, and Pete had awkwardly told her to reach out if she ever needed anything. "Pete, it's Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. I'm sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me." Pete's gravelly voice came through the phone. "Everything okay?" "I don't know, maybe. People keep giving me money and things, and I'm grateful, I really am, but I feel like I'm taking advantage somehow, like I don't deserve this much help." Pete was quiet for a moment. "You know what I learned? People don't help because you deserve it. They help because they need to, because it makes them feel less helpless in a world that's often pretty damn helpless. You're giving them something by accepting their help. You're giving them the chance to matter. Is that how you felt when you helped me? Honestly, I felt like I was paying off a debt I didn't even know I owed. To all the people I'd let down, to myself, to, I don't know, the universe maybe. Sarah found herself smiling despite her anxiety. That's very philosophical for a baseball player, Pete laughed. Don't tell anyone, I've got a reputation to maintain. They talked for a while longer, and Sarah realized something. Pete understood. He knew what it was like to be simultaneously helped and judged, to be grateful and uncomfortable, to have your life picked apart by strangers. His situation was different, of course. He'd brought his troubles on himself while hers were largely circumstantial, but the emotional territory was similar. Can I ask you something? Sarah said. What are you going to do with all this attention? Are you going to, I don't know, start a charity or write a book or something? Hell no, Pete said immediately. I'm just trying to live my life and not screw it up worse than I already have. If that inspires people, great. But I'm not trying to be anyone's role model. Too late, Sarah said gently. Whether you want to be or not, you already are. Across town, Pete hung up the phone and stared at the wall of his apartment. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. Whether you want to be or not, you already are. A role model. Him, Pete Rose, banned from baseball, 3-time divorcee, compulsive gambler, the man who'd lied to commissioners and reporters and fans for years. A role model. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so terrifying. His phone rang again. His son, Pete Rose Jr., calling from his home in Pennsylvania. Dad, you see the Sports Illustrated article? What article? They did a piece on you. Redemption in baseball. Can America forgive Pete Rose? It's actually pretty fair. Talks about your mistakes, but also about what you did for that woman and what it represents. Pete felt his chest tighten. I don't want to read it. Dad, I said I don't want to read it. I'm tired of people analyzing me, picking apart everything I do or don't do. I just want to be left alone. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then his son said quietly, You know what I remember most about being a kid? How you could never just enjoy anything. Every success had to be bigger. Every win had to be followed by another win. You couldn't just be good. You had to be the best. And even when you were the best, it wasn't enough. What's your point? My point is that maybe this is your chance to just be. Not the hit king, not the band legend, not the redemption story. Just a guy who did something nice and is trying to live his life. But you can't do that if you're constantly running from attention or hiding from your own impact. After they hung up, Pete sat in the growing darkness of his apartment, not bothering to turn on lights. His son was right. He'd spent his whole life chasing something, hits, records, the perfect bet, redemption, and missing the simple act of being present in his own life. The irony was that he'd finally done something without ulterior motive, without calculation, and it had created more attention and expectation than anything he'd done intentionally. 2 days before Christmas, Pete received an unexpected visitor. There was a knock on his door at 9 in the morning. Pete opened it to find a man in his 50s, Latino, wearing a maintenance worker's uniform. Mr. Rose, my name is Carlos Mendez. I know you don't know me, but I wanted to thank you. Pete blinked, confused. Thank me for what? Carlos smiled, a bit embarrassed. Can I come in? Just for a minute. Pete hesitated, then stepped aside. Coffee? That would be great. Thank you. As Pete poured 2 cups of coffee in his small kitchen, Carlos explained. I work maintenance at 3 different buildings, trying to support my family. My youngest daughter, she's 8, she has diabetes. The medical bills, they're crushing us. Insurance doesn't cover everything and we were drowning. Pete handed him a mug. I'm sorry to hear that. When I saw what you did, what you started, I thought, maybe there's hope. So I set up my own GoFundMe, told our story. People responded. Not as much as for Sarah Mitchell, but enough. Enough to pay 3 months of medical bills, enough to breathe a little. Carlos's eyes filled with tears. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because you showed me something I'd forgotten. That there are good people in the world, that asking for help isn't shameful, that we're all in this together, you know? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn baseball card. Pete Rose, 1975, in his Cincinnati Reds uniform, mid-swing. My father gave me this when I was 7 years old back in El Salvador. He told me about you, about how you played like every game mattered, how you never gave up. This card survived a civil war, immigration, 30 years of moving around. I keep it in my wallet. Carlos held out the card. Will you sign it? For my daughter. She wants to meet you, but I know you're busy, so... Pete took the card with shaking hands. He'd signed thousands of autographs in his life, maybe hundreds of thousands. At baseball card shows, at charity events, for fans who approached him in restaurants and airports. But this felt different. What's your daughter's name? Rosa, after my mother. Pete pulled out a Sharpie from the kitchen drawer and wrote, To Rosa, stay strong, never give up. Your friend, Pete Rose. He handed the card back to Carlos, who looked at it like it was made of gold. Thank you, Carlos whispered. You don't know what this means. I'm starting to understand, Pete said. After Carlos left, Pete stood at his window watching the street below. People hurried past, bundled against the cold, carrying shopping bags and coffee cups, absorbed in their own worlds. Each one of them fighting their own battles, carrying their own burdens. He thought about Sarah and Emma, about Carlos and Rosa, about Marcus Thompson and his vision of a more honest Hall of Fame, about the old man at the ballpark who remembered seeing him play in 1963, about his daughter Fawn and his son Pete Jr., who'd never stopped believing there was something good in him worth saving. All these people, connected by the thinnest of threads, a moment of kindness in a supermarket, captured by chance on someone's cell phone, shared across social media, rippling outward in ways no one could have predicted. That evening, Pete made another decision. He called Sarah. How would you feel about starting something? He asked. Something real, something that could help people like you and Carlos and others who are struggling? What do you mean? A foundation maybe, or a fund? I don't know exactly what it would look like, but something that takes all this attention, all this goodwill, and channels it into something lasting, not about me, not about publicity, just about helping people who need it. Sarah was quiet for a moment. You're serious? I'm serious. I've got some money saved. Not as much as I used to, but enough to start something. And I bet there are people who would contribute, especially after everything that's happened. What do you think? I think... Sarah paused. I think it's scary. I have no idea how to run a foundation. Neither do I. But we could figure it out, or find people who know what they're doing. The question is, should we? Sarah thought about Emma, about Carlos's daughter Rosa, about all the families out there struggling to make ends meet, choosing between medicine and food, between heat and electricity, between dignity and survival. Yes, she said finally, we should. Christmas came and went. Pete spent it with Fawn and her family, his grandchildren filling the house with noise and joy that both delighted and exhausted him. He sat in a corner watching them open presents, remembering Christmases when his own kids were young, when he'd often been absent, away on road trips or at the track, or simply too self-absorbed to be fully present. You okay, Dad? Fawn asked, sitting down beside him with 2 glasses of wine. Just thinking about all the time I wasted. You're here now. That's what matters. Is it enough? Fawn looked at her father, this complicated, flawed, occasionally infuriating man who'd given her life and broken her heart and was now, finally, in his 70s, trying to figure out how to be better. I don't know if enough is the right word, she said honestly, but it's something, and something is better than nothing. Pete clinked his glass against hers. I'll drink to that. By New Year's Eve, Pete and Sarah had met with a lawyer and an accountant. The Pete and Sarah Foundation. They'd argued about the name, with Pete insisting his name shouldn't be first, and Sarah arguing it should, since he was providing the initial funding, was officially established. Its mission: to provide emergency financial assistance to working families facing temporary hardships. No big overhead, no fancy offices, no executive salaries, just direct help to people who needed it, administered by a small board that would review applications and distribute funds. Sarah would manage the day-to-day operations, working part-time while maintaining her nursing job. Pete would be the figurehead, the name that brought attention, though he made it clear he wanted minimal involvement in actual decisions. I'll show up when you need me to, he told Sarah, for fundraisers or interviews or whatever. But this is your baby. You know what people need better than I ever could. The foundation's existence was announced in early January, and the response was immediate. Donations flooded in, small amounts from ordinary people, larger checks from local businesses, even a significant contribution from the MLB Players Association, which acknowledged Pete's contributions to the game, even as they maintained the ban against him. Within 3 weeks, they'd helped 12 families, a single father whose car had broken down and he couldn't get to work, a grandmother raising her grandchildren who'd been hit with an unexpected medical bill. A young couple whose house had flooded and insurance wouldn't cover all the damage. Each application came with a story, and Pete insisted on reading every one. Sarah would find him some mornings at the small office they'd rented, going through files, his reading glasses perched on his nose, completely absorbed. "This one," he'd say, tapping a folder. "The woman whose husband died and left her with 3 kids and a mortgage. Let's cover 3 months of payments, give her time to figure things out. Pete, we have a committee that's supposed to make these decisions." "I know, but I'm on the committee, and this is my decision. Approve it." Sarah would smile and shake her head, but she'd approve it because Pete's instincts were good. He had a way of seeing through the paperwork to the people behind it, of understanding what desperation looked like because he'd felt it himself, in different contexts, but with the same crushing weight. One Friday afternoon in late January, a woman came into the office without an appointment. She was in her 60s, well-dressed, with kind eyes and an uncertain smile. "Is Pete Rose here?" she asked Sarah, who was working at the reception desk. "He's in a meeting." "Can I help you with something? I wanted to meet him, to thank him." Sarah had heard variations of this dozens of times now. "Are you one of the families we've helped?" "No, nothing like that. I'm Mary Beth Patterson. I'm a therapist here in Cincinnati, and since your foundation started, I've seen something remarkable happen." She sat down, uninvited but welcome. "I have several clients who've been dealing with depression, anxiety, hopelessness. The kind that comes from financial strain, from feeling like no matter how hard you work, you can't get ahead. And ever since this Pete Rose story started, since your foundation began, I've watched them shift." "Shift how?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. "They have hope again, not because they think Pete Rose is going to save them personally, but because they've seen evidence that people care, that community exists, that help is possible. It's given them permission to ask for support when they need it, to believe that struggling doesn't mean failing." Mary Beth's eyes were bright with emotion. "You and Pete, you've changed the narrative in this city. From pull yourself up by your bootstraps to we're in this together. That's not a small thing, that's transformative." Pete emerged from his meeting, actually just him going through files in the back room, and stopped short when he saw Mary Beth. "This is Mary Beth Patterson," Sarah said. "She's a therapist, and she wanted to thank you." Mary Beth stood and extended her hand. "Mr. Rose, what you've started here is affecting people in ways you can't even measure. I see it every day in my practice. Thank you." Pete shook her hand, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just trying not to screw up for once." "You're doing much more than that. You're showing people how to be human." After Mary Beth left, Pete sat down heavily in the chair she'd vacated. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly. "Maybe not," Sarah replied. "But you're getting it anyway. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Pete looked at her, this remarkable young woman who'd gone from a struggling single mother to the director of a foundation, who'd transformed her own moment of vulnerability into a mission to help others. "I'm going to keep showing up," he said, "every day. For as long as I can. That's all anyone can ask." That night, Pete Rose sat in his apartment with a whiskey he wasn't really drinking, looking at the statistics of his life laid out on his coffee table. The foundation had helped 23 families in its first month. The ripple effects of that help, children who could stay in their schools, parents who could keep their jobs, elderly people who could afford their medications, were incalculable. 23 families helped versus 4,256 hits accumulated. Which number mattered more? Pete had spent his entire life chasing numbers, breaking records, being defined by statistics. Hits, games played, consecutive game streaks, batting averages. His identity had been quantifiable, measurable, rankable. But how did you measure the value of a child who had crayons when she thought she couldn't have them? How did you rank the impact of a family that didn't lose their home because someone stepped in at the right moment? How did you calculate the worth of hope restored, dignity preserved, community strengthened? These weren't statistics that would appear in any record book. They wouldn't get him into the Hall of Fame. They wouldn't rehabilitate his image, or erase his mistakes, or change the fundamental facts of his complicated legacy. But they were real. They mattered. They were his, created not through talent or skill or natural ability, but through simple choice. The choice to see someone who needed help and to help them. The choice to keep showing up even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient. The choice to be, at 73 years old, better than he'd been at 50 or 30 or 20. Pete Rose finished his whiskey, which had grown warm in his hand, and made a decision. Tomorrow he would call Marcus Thompson and ask if he could visit Cooperstown, not to plead his case for induction, not to stage some dramatic confrontation, but simply to see the Hall of Fame, to understand what he'd lost and what he'd never have, and to make peace with it. Because legacy, he was beginning to understand, wasn't something that happened to you or was bestowed upon you by authorities and institutions. Legacy was what you built, day by day, choice by choice, in the small moments when no one was watching and in the public moments when everyone was. His Hall of Fame was being constructed differently now, not in Cooperstown, but in Cincinnati. Not in bronze plaques, but in the lives of families who'd been helped, in the community that was learning to take care of its own, in the example of an imperfect man trying imperfectly to do better. And maybe, Pete thought as he prepared for bed, maybe that was enough. Maybe that was more than enough. Maybe that was everything. Spring arrived in Cincinnati with the promise of renewal, the way it always did. The Ohio River, swollen with winter runoff, flowed strong and muddy through the heart of the city. Bradford pear trees burst into clouds of white blossoms along the avenues. And at Great American Ballpark, the crack of the bat during spring training echoed across the empty seats, a sound as familiar and comforting as a heartbeat. Pete Rose stood outside the ballpark on opening day, April 1st, watching crowds stream toward the entrances. He hadn't planned to be here. He'd actually planned to stay home, avoiding the chaos and noise and the complicated feelings that baseball still stirred in him. But Fawn had called that morning and said simply, "Dad, it's opening day. You belong there." So here he was, in the same upper deck seats he'd purchased that afternoon months ago when all this started, watching the Reds take the field against the Pittsburgh Pirates. The crowd roared as the starting lineup was announced, that particular sound that only a baseball stadium could produce. Thousands of voices united in anticipation and hope and the annual belief that this might be the year. Pete Rose. He turned to find a young man, couldn't have been more than 30, looking at him with wide eyes. The man wore a vintage Reds jersey, number 14, Pete's number, and held the hand of a little boy who couldn't have been more than 5. "I'm sorry to bother you," the young man said, "but I wanted to introduce my son, Jackson. This is Pete Rose. He's the reason I fell in love with baseball." The little boy looked up at Pete with solemn eyes. "Are you famous?" Pete laughed, genuinely amused. "I used to be. Now I'm just old. My daddy says you got more hits than anyone ever." "That's true, I did." The young man crouched down next to his son. Mr. Rose played the game the right way. He never gave up, never took a play off, always hustled. "That's what I want you to remember, okay?" Jackson nodded seriously, then held out a baseball and a Sharpie. "Will you sign my ball?" Pete took the ball, feeling its familiar weight in his palm, and signed it carefully. As he handed it back, the young man said, "I also wanted to thank you for what you did for that woman, for starting the foundation. My sister lost her husband last year, and your foundation helped her keep her house. You saved her life, literally. I'm glad we could help," Pete said, meaning it. "It means something, seeing someone like you choose to do good. Means maybe we all can, no matter what mistakes we've made." The young man extended his hand. "Thank you for coming back to the game. Thank you for reminding us what matters." As they walked away, Pete felt something shift in his chest. Coming back to the game. He hadn't thought of it that way, but maybe that's exactly what he was doing. Not coming back to play, not coming back to some official capacity, but coming back to the pure love of baseball that had made him who he was before all the complications, before the gambling and the lies and the ban. The game started, and Pete lost himself in it the way he used to as a child, sitting in the bleachers at Crosley Field with his father. The strategy, the rhythm, the possibility contained in every pitch. Baseball moved slowly enough that you could think, fast enough that you had to pay attention. It was perfect and imperfect, fair and unfair, heartbreaking and joyful, often in the same inning. The Reds were losing 3-1 in the bottom of the 8th when Pete's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, "Turn on Channel 5 News now." Frowning, Pete pulled up the local news stream on his phone. The anchor, Jennifer Wright, who'd interviewed them months ago, was mid-sentence. "Remarkable development in the Pete Rose story. We've just learned that an anonymous donor has contributed $1 million to the Pete and Sarah Foundation, with a condition that Pete Rose be allowed to throw out the first pitch at a Reds game this season as a thank you for his service to the community." Pete's hands went numb. He nearly dropped his phone. The broadcast continued. "Reds management has confirmed they're reviewing the request. While Pete Rose remains banned from baseball by the league, ceremonial appearances are technically at the discretion of individual teams. This could be the first time Rose sets foot on the field in an official capacity since his ban in 1989. The stadium around Pete seemed to fade away. $1 million. The first pitch returned to the field. It was too much, too fast, too impossible. His phone rang. Sarah. Pete, are you watching? Yeah. It's real. I just got off the phone with the donor's lawyer. The money is already being transferred. Pete, this is incredible. Who would do this? Who has that kind of money and cares enough about me to... I don't know. They want to remain anonymous. But Pete, you could go back to the field. You could stand on that mound one more time. Pete closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 23 again, taking the field at Crossley Field for his first game as a Red, feeling the Kentucky bluegrass under his cleats, hearing the crowd chant his name. He was 38, getting his 4,000th hit, sprinting to first base with the kind of joy that transcended the game itself. He was in his 40s, managing the team, making decisions, living and dying with every play. And then he was 73, banned, exiled, watching from the outside as the game he loved continued without him. I can't, Pete said into the phone. What? I can't do it, Sarah. If I go back now, people will think I only started the foundation to rehabilitate my image, to manipulate my way back into baseball's good graces. Everything we've built, everything we've done, it'll be tainted. Pete, we send back the money. We thank the donor, but explain that we can't accept it under these conditions. The foundation has to stand on its own merit, not be a bargaining chip for my redemption. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. That's $1 million, Pete. Do you know how many families we could help with that? I know. Believe me, I know. But some things matter more than money. You're serious about this? I'm serious. Another pause. Then Sarah said quietly, You've changed, you know that. The Pete Rose of 20 years ago would have jumped at this opportunity. The Pete Rose of 20 years ago made a lot of bad decisions. I'm trying to make better ones now. After he hung up, Pete sat in the stadium watching the game without really seeing it. The Reds mounted a comeback in the 9th inning, loading the bases with 2 outs, the crowd on its feet roaring encouragement. The batter fought through a full count, then laced a double into the right field corner. 2 runs scored. The Reds won 4-3, and the stadium erupted in celebration. Pete stayed in his seat long after most of the crowd had left, watching the grounds crew prepare the field for the next day's game. He thought about all the games he'd played, all the moments that had defined his career, and realized something profound. Those moments weren't his anymore. They belonged to the people who'd watched them, who'd been inspired by them, who'd built their own memories around them. His new moments, the ones he was creating now, helping Sarah, starting the foundation, choosing integrity over opportunity. These belonged to him alone. They were his to own, his to be proud of, his to build a different kind of legacy upon. The next day, news of Pete's decision hit the media. Pete Rose turns down $1 million donation, refuses path back to baseball, the headlines read. Sports talk radio exploded with debates. Some called it noble, others called it stupid. Some said it proved he'd genuinely changed. Others said it was a calculated move to seem humble. Pete ignored all of it. He had work to do. The foundation's waiting list had grown to over 200 families. Each application represented a story, a struggle, a moment when life had become overwhelming and help was needed. Pete threw himself into reviewing them, making decisions, reaching out personally to people the foundation was helping. One afternoon in late April, he visited a family in Price Hill that the foundation had assisted, a disabled veteran named Marcus Johnson and his wife Angela, who were raising their 3 grandchildren after their daughter died of an overdose. The foundation had covered 6 months of their mortgage payments and provided funds for the children's school supplies and activities. Pete sat in their modest living room, drinking coffee that was too weak and eating cookies that Angela had made specifically for his visit, listening to Marcus talk about his granddaughter's soccer team and his grandson's struggles with reading and the youngest's obsession with dinosaurs. You probably get tired of hearing this, Marcus said, but what you're doing matters, not just the money, though God knows that helps, but the message, that we don't have to do this alone. I'm just trying to be useful, Pete said. You're being more than useful. You're being human. And you're showing the rest of us how to be human too. As Pete drove home through the streets of Cincinnati, he found himself taking the long way, driving past Crossley Field's former location, past the high school where he'd first made a name for himself, past the neighborhoods where he'd grown up. The city had changed, and hadn't changed, the way cities do, new buildings rising where old ones had stood, but the bones remaining the same. His phone rang, an unknown number. Pete almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Is this Pete Rose?" A woman's voice, older with a slight southern accent. "Yeah, this is Pete. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. You don't know me, but I'm the anonymous donor who offered the $1 million. Pete pulled over to the side of the road. "How did you get this number?" "I'm a resourceful woman, Mr. Rose, and I'm calling to tell you that your decision to refuse my donation under those conditions was the right one. It's exactly why I made the offer in the first place." "I don't understand." "I'm 81 years old, Mr. Rose. I've made a lot of money in my life through real estate and investments, and I've been thinking about what to do with it before I die. I saw what you and Sarah Mitchell built, and I wanted to support it. But I also wanted to know who you really were. Was this a genuine effort to help people, or was it a publicity stunt to get back into baseball's good graces?" Pete felt a flash of anger. "So it was a test." "Yes, and you passed. Which is why I'm now donating $2 million to your foundation, with no strings attached whatsoever. Use it to help families. That's all I ask." Pete sat in stunned silence. "I'll have my lawyer contact Sarah with the details," Eleanor continued. "But I wanted you to know personally that character is proven not when people are watching, but when they think no one is. You proved yours, Mr. Rose. Congratulations." She hung up before Pete could respond. $2 million. Unconditional. No strings, no ulterior motives, no paths back to anything except the work itself. Pete sat in his truck on the side of the road and, for the second time in his adult life, cried. Not from sadness or regret this time, but from something he'd rarely allowed himself to feel. Pride. Not in his baseball achievements or his records or anything he'd accomplished with a bat in his hand, but in this, in choosing the right thing when the wrong thing would have been easier. In building something that mattered more than his own redemption. The spring turned to summer and the foundation flourished. With Eleanor's donation, they expanded their reach, hiring a full-time staff, opening a second office, partnering with other local organizations to provide comprehensive support to families in crisis. Sarah quit her nursing job to manage the foundation full-time, though Pete insisted on paying her a salary that reflected her value. "You're making me uncomfortable," Sarah protested when she saw her first paycheck. "This is too much." "It's not enough," Pete countered. "You're literally changing people's lives every day. That's worth more than any salary I could pay you." By July, they'd helped over 300 families. The model they'd developed was being studied by nonprofits in other cities. Major League Baseball players started donating, creating a kind of informal support system that existed outside the official structures of the game. Even some of Pete's former teammates, guys he hadn't talked to in decades, reached out to contribute and offer their support. One August evening, Pete was working late at the foundation office when there was a knock on the door. He opened it to find a group of 5 people, all former recipients of the foundation's help, including Carlos Mendez and his daughter Rosa. "We wanted to say thank you," Carlos said. "All of us. You changed our lives, and we wanted to do something in return." Rosa stepped forward, holding a photograph in a frame. It showed all 5 families together, holding a banner that read, "The Pete Rose Foundation. Hope in action." "We want you to hang this in your office," Rosa said, her voice stronger than it had been when Carlos had first visited months ago. "So you remember that what you do matters. That you matter." Pete took the photograph, his eyes tracing the faces of these families he'd helped, parents and children, young and old, representing different backgrounds and stories, but united in their struggle and their survival. "Thank you," he managed to say. "This means more than you know." After they left, Pete hung the photograph on the wall behind his desk, where he'd see it every time he sat down to work. And he thought about legacy again, about what endures after we're gone. His 4,256 hits would always be in the record books. That was a fact, unchangeable and permanent. Whether his name would ever be in the Hall of Fame remained uncertain. But these families, this foundation, this network of support and kindness and community, this was something he'd built that would outlast him, that would continue helping people long after he was gone. In late September, exactly 1 year after that day in the Kroger supermarket, the foundation held its first annual fundraiser. They'd rented a modest banquet hall, invited donors and supporters, and planned a simple evening of dinner and speeches. Pete hadn't wanted to speak, but Sarah had insisted. People need to hear from you. They need to understand why this matters. So Pete stood at the podium looking out at 200 people who'd gathered to support the work they'd started, and he spoke from the heart. "I'm not good at speeches," he began. "I'm better with actions than words, but I want to tell you about a moment that changed my life. A year ago, I was standing in line at a grocery store, minding my own business, when I saw a young mother struggling to pay for her groceries. Her little girl wanted crayons, and she couldn't afford them, and something in me broke open. Or maybe something in me finally woke up. I've spent most of my life chasing things, records, wins, the perfect bet. I've made more mistakes than I can count, hurt more people than I deserve to hurt, and lost more than I should have lost. For a long time, I thought my story was over, that the last chapter had been written and it wasn't a good ending. But that moment in the supermarket showed me something. It showed me that our stories are never really over as long as we're still alive and capable of making choices. That redemption isn't about grand gestures or public apologies or being forgiven by institutions. It's about the small, daily decision to be better than you were yesterday. To see someone who needs help and to help them. To build something that matters more. To build something that matters more than your own ego or reputation or comfort. Sarah Mitchell and her daughter Emma didn't just receive help that day. They gave me something far more valuable. They gave me purpose. They reminded me that I still had something to contribute to this world, that my life wasn't defined solely by my worst moments, that I could still matter in ways that had nothing to do with baseball. This foundation isn't about me. It's about all of you. The families we've helped, the donors who've supported us, the volunteers who've given their time, and especially Sarah, who took a personal moment of vulnerability and transformed it into a mission that's touched hundreds of lives. I don't know if I'll ever be forgiven for my past mistakes. I don't know if I deserve to be, but I know that every day I wake up, I have a choice. I can be bitter about what I've lost, or I can be grateful for what I still have. I can focus on closed doors, or I can look for ways to open new ones for other people. I'm choosing the latter, not because it will get me into the Hall of Fame or rehabilitate my image, but because it's the right way to live. Because at 74 years old, I've finally figured out that the most important record you can set is the one of how many lives you've touched, how much kindness you've shown, how much love you've given. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for believing that broken people can still do beautiful things. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Pete stepped away from the podium to thunderous applause. Sarah stood and embraced him, tears streaming down her face. Emma, now 5 years old and growing like a weed, ran up and hugged his legs. "Mr. Pete, you're my favorite person," Emma said, looking up at him with absolute conviction. "You're my favorite person too, kiddo," Pete said, his voice thick with emotion. The rest of the evening was a blur of conversations and handshakes and stories from families whose lives had been changed. Pete listened to each one, storing them away in his memory like treasures. These were his real statistics now, not hits or runs or batting averages, but moments of connection, instances of help given and received, the tangible evidence that one person's choice to care could ripple outward in ways impossible to measure. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Marcus Thompson appeared. Pete hadn't known he'd been invited, but Sarah had reached out to him months ago, keeping him updated on the foundation's progress. "Pete," Marcus said, shaking his hand warmly, "that was quite a speech. I meant every word. I know you did. That's why I wanted to tell you something." Marcus glanced around to make sure they had relative privacy. "There's been a lot of discussion at the Hall of Fame about how to handle your legacy. Obviously, the band stands. That's not something we control. But there's growing consensus that we need to find a way to tell your story, the complete story, including what you've done this past year." Pete felt his heart rate quicken. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that we're developing an exhibit called Complicated Legacies, the Human Side of Baseball. It will feature players whose stories are complex, who made significant contributions to the game, but also serious mistakes. You'll be included along with others. It won't be in the main Hall of Fame gallery. The ban prevents that. But it will be in the museum, and it will be honest. Both your achievements and your failures, your brilliance and your flaws, your baseball career and your life after it. Including this?" Pete gestured to the banquet hall, the foundation's work. "Especially this. because this is part of your story too, maybe the most important part. Pete was quiet for a long moment. When I was young, all I wanted was to be in the Hall of Fame. It was the ultimate goal, the pinnacle, the thing that would prove I'd made it. And when I threw that away through my own stupidity and arrogance, I thought my life was over. And now I realize that the Hall of Fame is just a building, a beautiful, meaningful building full of history, but still just a building. What matters is the legacy you build in people's hearts, in communities, in the lives you touch. I'd rather be remembered by Sarah and Emma and Carlos and Rosa and all the families we've helped than by a bronze plaque that reduces 74 years of life to a paragraph of statistics. Marcus smiled. You know what the ironic thing is? That attitude, that wisdom, it's exactly the kind of thing that makes people think you belong in the Hall of Fame. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. Either way, I'll be okay. And Pete realized he meant it. He'd finally found peace with his past, acceptance of his present, and hope for his future. The three things that had eluded him for decades were suddenly his, not because he'd achieved some great redemption or been forgiven by the authorities, but because he'd learned to forgive himself by becoming someone worth forgiving. October arrived with its crisp air and falling leaves, and the baseball season ended with the Reds finishing in third place. Respectable but not spectacular, which seemed fitting for Cincinnati. Pete watched the playoffs from his apartment, feeling the old competitive fire, but also a strange contentment. The game would go on without him. It always had, and it always would. But he'd been part of it once, had given it everything he had, and now he was part of something else equally important. The foundation announced that they'd helped over 500 families in their first year and had enough funding to sustain operations for at least 5 more years. Other cities were starting their own versions, inspired by the Cincinnati model. Sarah had been invited to speak at conferences about non-profit management and community building. Emma had started kindergarten and told everyone that her Uncle Pete was a hero, which both embarrassed and delighted him. On October 15th, Pete's 74th birthday, he received an unexpected package. It was addressed in handwriting he didn't recognize, postmarked from Cooperstown, New York. Inside was a baseball, not just any baseball, but one signed by over 50 current Hall of Famers. Alongside their signatures were short messages. You belong here in spirit, if not in person. Tom Seaver. The Hit King always, respect. Johnny Bench. What you're doing matters. Keep going. Mike Schmidt. Character is proven over time. You're proving yours. Tony Gwynn. There was a note from Marcus Thompson. These men wanted you to know that while the institution has rules it must follow, their personal respect for you and what you've accomplished, both on the field and off, remains unchanged. You are, and always will be, one of them. Pete held the baseball, feeling its weight, tracing the signatures with his finger. It wasn't a Hall of Fame plaque. It wasn't reinstatement or official forgiveness, but it was something perhaps more valuable. Acknowledgement from his peers that his life mattered, that his contributions counted, that his transformation was real. That evening, Fawn threw him a small birthday party at her house. His son, Pete Jr., had flown in from Pennsylvania. His grandchildren had made him cards. Sarah and Emma came, bringing a homemade cake that was lopsided but delicious. Even Eleanor Whitmore, the mysterious donor, had sent a lavish gift basket. As Pete looked around the room at these people who loved him despite knowing all his flaws, who believed in him despite his history, who saw potential in him when he'd stopped seeing it in himself, he felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Speech!" someone called out, and everyone laughed and echoed the request. Pete stood, embarrassed but willing. "I'm not one for big speeches, as you all know, but I want to say thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me when I'd given up on myself. Thank you for seeing past the headlines and the controversies to the person underneath. Thank you for letting me be part of your lives." He looked at Emma, who was sitting on Sarah's lap, her eyes heavy with approaching sleep. "Someone once told me that life isn't about the records you break or the fame you achieve. It's about the moments when you choose to see another person's humanity and act accordingly. That's the real measure of a life well lived. That little girl over there, who's falling asleep on her mama, she'll probably never remember that day in the grocery store. She won't remember that her mother was struggling, or that a stranger helped, or that it became this big story. But hopefully, she'll grow up in a world where people take care of each other, where asking for help isn't shameful, where community matters more than individual glory. And if this foundation, if this movement we've started helps create that world, even just in Cincinnati, even just for a few hundred families, then everything I've been through, all the mistakes and pain and consequences, they weren't for nothing. They led me here, to this moment, to this work, to all of you, and I wouldn't change that for anything, not even a Hall of Fame plaque. Pete sat down to applause and a few sniffles. Emma had fallen fully asleep, her head on Sarah's shoulder, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit. Pete watched her sleeping, this child who'd inadvertently changed his life by being sad about crayons, and he thought about all the ways we're connected, all the invisible threads that bind us together, all the moments that seem insignificant until suddenly they're everything. As the party wound down and people began to leave, Pete found himself alone on the back deck with his son. "You seem different, Dad," Pete Jr. said, "lighter somehow." "I feel different, like I've been carrying a weight for so long that I forgot what it felt like to stand up straight. And now it's gone, or at least lighter." "What changed?" Pete thought about the question. "I stopped trying to control my legacy and started trying to build one worth having. I stopped worrying about what people thought of me and started focusing on being someone I could be proud of. I stopped running from my mistakes and started learning from them." "That's pretty profound for a ball player," Pete laughed. "Don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation to maintain." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over Cincinnati, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there, families were sitting down to dinner. Children were doing homework. Parents were worrying about bills and futures and how to make it all work. And some of them, thanks to the foundation, had a little less to worry about, had a little more breathing room, had a little more hope. "You know what the best part is?" Pete said. "I finally understand what my dad was trying to teach me all those years ago." "What's that?" "He used to say, Pete, play every game like it's your last, but live every day like you've got forever." I never understood the second part. I was so focused on the playing, on the competing, on the winning. But now I get it. You play hard because the game ends, but you live with intention because your impact continues. The way you treat people, the kindness you show, the help you give, that echoes forward long after you're gone. Pete Jr. put his arm around his father's shoulders. "I'm proud of you, Dad. I know I don't say it enough, but I am." "Thanks, son. That means more than you know." Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in mid-November and blanketing Cincinnati in white. Pete Rose woke on a Tuesday morning to find the world transformed, everything clean and new and full of possibility. He made his coffee, black as always, and sat at his small kitchen table looking out the window at the snow-covered street. Somewhere in this city, Sarah was getting Emma ready for school. Carlos was heading to his maintenance jobs. Marcus Johnson was helping his grandchildren with their breakfast. Rosa was probably playing with that baseball card her father had treasured for so many years, now signed by Pete Rose himself. All these lives, intersecting and overlapping, connected by choices and circumstances and the simple human need to help and be helped. Pete's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Meeting at 10 to review applications. We have 47 new families requesting assistance. Going to be a busy week." "I'll be there," Pete typed back. "Wouldn't miss it." He finished his coffee, showered, and dressed in the casual clothes he wore to the foundation office, khakis and a Reds polo shirt, comfortable shoes for the walking he did around the office. As he prepared to leave, he paused by the drawer where he kept his treasures. Emma's drawing, the baseball signed by Hall of Famers, letters from families they'd helped, newspaper clippings, and photos. He pulled out one photo in particular, the one from the fundraiser showing him Sarah and Emma standing together, all of them smiling, with the foundation's banner behind them. He looked at his own face in the photo and barely recognized himself. The hardness that had defined his features for so many years had softened. The bitterness that had lived in his eyes had been replaced by something warmer. He looked, Pete realized with surprise, happy. When was the last time he'd actually been happy? Really, genuinely happy, not just satisfied or content or distracted, but truly at peace with himself and his place in the world. He couldn't remember. Maybe he'd never been, not really. Even during the glory days, during the hitting streaks and the championships and the standing ovations, there had always been something driving him, some hunger that couldn't be satisfied, some need to prove himself that never went away. But now, at 74, with no records left to break and no redemption to chase and no glory to reclaim, he'd found something he'd been looking for his entire life without knowing it. Purpose that had nothing to do with his own ego or achievement or validation from others. Pete put the photo back in the drawer and headed out into the snowy morning. The foundation office was warm and bustling when he arrived. Sarah was already at her desk reviewing applications. 2 volunteers were processing donations. A young intern, a social work student from the University of Cincinnati, was updating their database. The photo that Carlos and Rosa had given him hung prominently on the wall, a reminder of why they did this work. "Morning, Pete," Sarah called out. "Ready for a busy day?" "Always." They spent the morning reviewing applications, making decisions about who to help and how much to provide. Each case was different. A medical emergency here, a car repair there, rent assistance, utility bills, school expenses, unexpected crisis after unexpected crisis. But each represented a family, a story, a moment when life had become overwhelming and help was needed. Around noon, there was a knock on the door. Pete answered it to find a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, standing nervously in the hallway. "Is this the Pete Rose Foundation?" the boy asked. "It is. Can I help you?" "My name is Devon Carter. My mom, she filled out an application a few weeks ago. We needed help with rent after my dad left. And you helped us. You paid 3 months so my mom could catch up." "I remember your case," Pete said. Come in. Is everything okay?" Devon stepped inside, clutching a folder. "Everything's better than okay. Because of what you did, my mom didn't have to work 3 jobs anymore. She could cut back to 2, which meant she could actually be home sometimes, and she was there last week when I got my college acceptance letter." He pulled out the letter from the folder with trembling hands. "I got into Ohio State. Full academic scholarship. I'm going to be the first person in my family to go to college." Pete felt his throat tighten. "That's amazing, Devon. Congratulations. I wouldn't have made it without you. When my dad left, I was thinking about dropping out of school to work full-time to help my mom, but she wouldn't let me, and then you helped us, and I could focus on school instead of just survival. You gave me a chance to have a future." Devon extended his hand, and Pete shook it. "I wanted to thank you in person, and I wanted to promise you something. When I graduate, when I get a good job, I'm going to donate to this foundation. I'm going to help other kids the way you helped me. I'm going to pay it forward." After Devon left, Pete stood in the middle of the office with tears streaming down his face. Sarah came over and hugged him, saying nothing, understanding everything. This was it. This was what it was all about. Not the Hall of Fame, or the records, or the redemption, or any of the things Pete had thought mattered. It was about Devon Carter getting to go to college. It was about Emma having crayons. It was about Rosa getting to keep her house. It was about hundreds of families, thousands of individuals having slightly better lives because someone had chosen to help. That afternoon, as Pete prepared to leave the office, his phone rang. An unknown number again, which he'd learned might be important. "Pete Rose," he answered. "Mr. Rose, my name is Dr. Catherine Mills. I'm a professor of sports ethics at Columbia University, and I'd like to invite you to speak to my class about redemption, second chances, and the ethics of forgiveness in sports." Pete almost laughed. "Doc, I'm not qualified to speak about ethics. I'm probably the last person who should be teaching about that." "On the contrary," Dr. Mills said, "I think you're exactly the person who should be teaching about it. You've lived it. You've made mistakes, faced consequences, and found a way to create meaning from failure. That's a more valuable lesson than any theoretical discussion could provide." Pete hesitated, then said, "Can I think about it?" "Of course, but I hope you'll consider it. Your story, all of it, the good and bad, has value. Don't underestimate the impact of your truth." After he hung up, Pete sat in his truck in the parking lot, thinking about Dr. Mills's words. Your story has value. For so long, he'd thought his story was a cautionary tale at best, a tragedy at worst. But maybe it was something more. Maybe it was proof that people could change, that mistakes didn't have to be final, that the third act could be different from the first two. He called Fawn. "I need your opinion on something." "Shoot," he explained about the speaking invitation. "Should I do it, or is it hypocritical? Me talking about ethics?" Fawn was quiet for a moment. "Dad, do you remember when I was in high school and I cheated on that chemistry test?" "Yeah, you were devastated when you got caught." "I was devastated because I disappointed you, and you sat me down and told me something I've never forgotten. You said, 'In Fawn, everyone makes mistakes. The question is what you do after. Do you learn from them, or do you repeat them?' You'd already made your mistakes by then, already been banned from baseball. And I remember thinking, if my dad can tell me this after everything he's been through, then maybe there's hope for all of us. You never told me that. I'm telling you now, so yes, Dad, do the speech, tell your story. Because it's not a story about perfection, it's a story about being human, and that's the most valuable story there is." Pete agreed to speak at Columbia in the spring. Then he agreed to another speaking engagement at a high school in Cincinnati. Then at a non-profit conference in Chicago, word spread that Pete Rose, the hit king, the band legend, was willing to talk honestly about his life. No sanitizing, no excuses, just truth, and people wanted to hear it. By the time spring arrived again, marking a full year since the foundation's first fundraiser, Pete had spoken to dozens of groups. Each time, he told the same story, about hubris and failure, about consequences and regret, about a moment in a grocery store that changed everything, about learning that redemption wasn't something bestowed by institutions, but something built through daily choices. And each time, people responded. They asked questions, shared their own stories, thanked him for his honesty. Many admitted their own mistakes, their own struggles with forgiveness and redemption. Pete realized he wasn't special in his failures. Everyone had them. He was just willing to talk about his publicly. On April 14th, exactly 18 months after that day in Kroger, Pete received a call from the Commissioner of Baseball. Mr. Rose, I want to inform you personally that the league has decided to allow you to participate in ceremonial activities, including throwing first pitches and attending team celebrations. Though the ban on your employment or placement on the Hall of Fame ballot remains in effect, Pete sat down heavily. Why now? Because you've demonstrated something important over the past year and a half. You've shown genuine change without asking for anything in return. You've built something meaningful without using it to leverage your way back into the game. You've accepted responsibility without making excuses. That matters. I don't know what to say. Say you'll throw out the first pitch on opening day next year. The Reds have already agreed. Pete thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. I'll do it, but on one condition. What's that? Sarah Mitchell and her daughter Emma throw it with me. This isn't my moment. It's ours. There was a pause. Then the commissioner laughed. Done, I'll make the arrangements. When Pete told Sarah about the invitation, she cried. When he told Emma, she jumped up and down screaming, I'm going to throw a baseball at a real baseball game. Opening day 2027 dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect Cincinnati spring day that makes you believe in new beginnings. Great American Ballpark was packed with over 40,000 fans, all of them buzzing with anticipation, not just for the game, but for the ceremony before it. Pete stood in the tunnel leading to the field, wearing a Reds jacket, his heart pounding harder than it had during any at-bat in his career. Beside him stood Sarah, looking elegant in a Reds jersey, and Emma, now 6 years old, wearing a miniature version of Pete's old uniform, number 14. You ready? Pete asked them. I'm nervous, Sarah admitted. Me too, Pete said, but we've got each other, right? Emma grabbed both their hands. We're a team! The announcement came over the loudspeaker. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Pete Rose, Sarah Mitchell, and Emma Mitchell to throw out the ceremonial first pitch. They walked out together into the sunshine and the roar of the crowd. Pete felt the familiar grass beneath his feet, smelled the leather and chalk and hot dogs, heard the deafening applause that washed over them in waves. But this time it felt different. He wasn't alone. He wasn't isolated in his glory or his shame. He was part of something bigger than himself. They walked to the mound together, Pete, Sarah, and Emma, and stood there for a moment, taking it all in. Pete looked around the stadium at all these faces turned toward them, and he thought about all the times he'd stood on a mound or at home plate, playing the game he loved with singular focus and determination. But this moment was better than all of those combined, because he wasn't alone. Pete crouched down next to Emma. You remember what I taught you? Step and throw right toward home plate. You can do this. Emma nodded solemnly, then looked up at the catcher waiting behind home plate. She wound up with exaggerated motion that made the crowd laugh with delight and threw. The ball bounced twice, but made it to the catcher, who caught it and raised it triumphantly. The crowd went wild. Sarah went next, her throw more accurate, reaching the catcher on a bounce. More applause. Then it was Pete's turn. He held the baseball, feeling its familiar weight, and for a moment he was every age he'd ever been. The 8-year-old playing catch with his father, the rookie taking the field for the first time, the veteran chasing records, the band player watching from outside, the 74-year-old man who'd found redemption not through reinstatement but through service. He threw a perfect strike. The crowd exploded. But Pete wasn't looking at the catcher. He was looking at Sarah and Emma, both of them smiling and waving to the crowd. And he realized that this moment, this connection, this love and community and shared purpose, this was what he'd been searching for his entire life. Not glory, not records, not fame, but belonging. Being part of something larger than himself. Mattering in ways that had nothing to do with statistics. As they walked off the field together, Emma grabbed Pete's hand. Mr. "Pete, can we do this every year?" Pete laughed, his face wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. "I'd like that, kiddo. I'd like that a lot." That night, Pete sat in his apartment watching the replays on the news. The image of the three of them on the mound had already gone viral. Pete Rose, the hit king, throwing out the first pitch with the young mother and daughter he'd helped in a grocery store, their foundation having now assisted over 1,000 families. Full circle, the sportscasters were calling it. Redemption completed. But Pete knew better. Redemption was never complete. It was an ongoing process, a daily choice, a continuous effort to be better than you were yesterday. You didn't arrive at redemption, you lived it. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Thompson. "Told you that you mattered. The exhibit opens in 2 months. Hope you'll come to the opening." Pete typed back, "I'll be there, with Sarah and Emma." Another text, this one from Devin Carter. "Watched you throw out that pitch, Mr. Rose. Made me cry. You're proof that people can change. Thanks for showing me that." Pete set down his phone and looked around his small apartment. It wasn't much, a far cry from the mansions he'd lived in during his playing days, but it was enough. He was enough. His life, with all its triumphs and failures, its records and regrets, its glory and shame, was enough. More than enough. It was meaningful. It was purposeful. It was, finally, at peace with itself. Pete Rose went to bed that night and slept better than he had in decades. He dreamed of baseball, but not of games he'd played or records he'd set. He dreamed of Emma learning to hit, of Sarah cheering from the stands, of Devin Carter playing catch with his future children, of all the families the foundation would help in years to come. He dreamed of legacy, but not the kind that lived in record books or Hall of Fame plaques. The kind that lived in people's hearts, in communities strengthened, in lives changed for the better. The kind that mattered most. When Pete Rose woke the next morning, the sun was shining through his window, and he heard the sounds of Cincinnati waking up around him. His city, his home, his redemption. He made his coffee, black as always, and sat at his small kitchen table. And for the first time in 74 years, Pete Rose felt complete. Not because he'd achieved everything he'd wanted, but because he'd become someone he could be proud of, and in the end, that was the only record that really mattered.